Well, hello there. I'm so glad that you're here. This is a video series that's designed to be kind of a space where I just talk about songs. Songs that I like, songs that I think are interesting, songs that are catchy, and, well, I've always been excited about music, and to be honest, I can kind of tend to be a nerd about it, so this is kind of the space for me to do that. So, I like to look at the songs, I like to try to explain why these songs are so good, right? What makes them good, what makes them interesting, and what makes them catchy. Although I'm really excited to have you along for this series, it's really hard to understand the kinds of things that I'm trying to say if we don't take first a small look at some music theory. And I know that that usually makes people scared because music theory is usually regarded as something that's very hard, something that's really complicated. But I guarantee you, we will go through this journey together, and in the next couple of videos or so, I will attempt to summarize all the important things that you'll need to know for what I'm going to talk about when I go into depth on these songs. So sit tight, and without further ado, we will get started. So first of all, of course, today we're going to talk just about rhythm, but I kind of want to give a brief overview of music notation and the kinds of things that it can tell us. In this excerpt, we can see many different things. We can see what the pitch of a note is, so you can see what line or space it's on. So it's either going to be going through the middle of this line, or it's going to be centered around this space. And depending on how high or low it is in this complex of lines that we like to call the staff, it gives how high or low that note is. We also have the note duration, so how long does that note last for? And it's specified by the shape of the note stem. So the note is composed of a dot and then a stem that extends upward from it or downwards from it. And you can see that the first one, the stem just goes straight up, and the second one, the stem goes up, and then it has a turn like that. And it's beamed to another note. So we'll go over that in detail because that's kind of the topic of today. We read from left to right as we normally would when we're reading a book. So the notes that are to the left happen before the notes that go to the right. So that means that this note happened before this note, and so on and so forth. Also, if you're confused that there's multiple dots, all of these dots stacked on top of each other means is that all of these notes are happening at the same time. And finally, we have this marking here, the MF, MP, mezzo forte, mezzo piano, but the dynamical markings are really just here to tell you how loud or how soft. And there's a hierarchy down there, but the ones that are important to know is that piano is soft, then it's mezzo piano, then mezzo forte, then forte. That's the loudest, and then you can get some beyond that, but those are the important ones. There's other symbols that indicate volume as well. You could put like a little caret over the note, which means that that particular note needs emphasis, which means it's going to be louder than the others around it. But for like general dynamics, these are the symbols that we use. The main purpose of today is to talk about rhythm. So in rhythm, it's really important to know how long do different notes last. So as you can see here, the first one actually doesn't have any stem. It's just a dot with an open circle. And so the open circle with no stem is a whole note. Then there's a half note, and a half note looks like a whole note. It's got an open circle and it's got a stem. And a half note is half as long as a whole note. A quarter note is the next one, which is the same as a half note except the dot is filled in. This means a quarter note is, again, half the length of a half note. Then we go to the eighth notes. We find that the eighth notes are half the length of the quarter note. And again, they look like quarter notes, except they have a singular flag coming off of them. Now, a lot of times people will like to beam them together. So you will either see them with a single flag or you see them with a single beam. But in either case, these symbols mean the same thing. Then we can keep dividing it in half. We would have the 16th note. And the 16th note is half of an eighth note. It's got two flags and or two beams, depending on how you look at it. We also have our rests. Rest represents a moment of silence, whereas a note is something that's actually played. So again, whole rest lasts for as long as a whole note. Half rest, half as long. Quarter rest, half as long as a half rest. Eighth rest, half as long as a quarter rest. And 16th rest is half as long as an eighth rest. These two are a little bit tricky, but the way that you can remember it is the whole rest is always going to be coming off of the fourth line, whereas the middle line, the third line, is going to be where the half rest comes off of. I want you to realize that it's exactly like fractions. So think of them as fractions, right? Because we know that if you added 2/8 together, they would make 1/4. But wait, there's always more, and it always gets more complicated. Let's talk about dots. What the hell does this even mean? Okay, so we got what looks like a half note on the left, and it's got a dot in it, and I just said that a half note would be divided into 2 quarter notes, but when you put the dot on the half note, it ends up being worth the duration of 3 quarter notes. Now, why is this? That's because a dot adds 1/2 of that note's duration to itself. So that means that a dotted half note is 1.5 half notes. That would mean that it would be equal to 3 quarter notes. And we can do a math check with this too, because the dot basically means multiply this duration by 3 halves, or 1.5. So if we multiply 3 halves times 1/2, we come up with 3/4, which would be 3 quarters, 3 quarter notes. So how about the next one? Let's just try this for fun, right? Can you figure out the following? What is this quarter note with a dot? What's this dotted quarter note equal to? Well, if you've been paying attention, it's going to be 3/8 notes. Okay, and we're back, and we're talking this time about simple meters. Meters, also known as time signatures, basically tells us what goes into each measure. And so in music, the same amount of time goes into each measure. And so the meters tell us in detail what happens inside of each of these measures. So you got these 2 numbers here you can see right here, 4 and 4. So the top number is the number of things, which is also the number of beats in simple meters. And the bottom number is what those things are, so what kind of duration note it is. So if you look over by the 4/4, we call it 4/4. This means that there are 4 quarter notes and 4 beats per bar. Also, you'll notice here the C, it's common time, also means 4/4, and you can see in both of these cases that 4 quarter notes are in the space. 3/4, same idea, 3 quarter notes, 3 beats per bar. 2/4, 2 quarter notes, 2 beats per bar, same idea. 5/4, 5 quarter notes, 5 beats per bar. 3/2, 3 half notes, so they're different kinds of beats than the 3/4, but there are still 3 beats. And then finally, this is cut time. And you can see what's contained in it, but what else could you call it? Just like we call common time 4/4, what would you call that? Well, you can see what fits in there, and so we know that there are 2 half notes fitting in there, so we would also call it 2/2. That's all great and everything, but we've been just kind of operating on a basis of cutting stuff in half, and then cutting those things in half, and then cutting those things in half. Cutting things in half is great, but what if we wanted to cut something in thirds? How about what if we wanted to divide a quarter note into 3 equal parts? We learned about eighth notes. There's 2 of those to make a quarter note. 16th notes, there'd be 2 and an eighth note, so there'd be 4 of those to make a quarter note. So there isn't a type of note for this. Or is there? Introducing triplets. Now, triplets are kind of fun, because you can see here normally in a bar of 2/4, you'd have 2 quarter notes, so therefore 4 eighth notes. So somehow we managed to squeeze 6 eighth notes into a single bar, which is like really weird, right? So the 3 bracket, as I like to call it, because it's a bracket with a 3 in the middle, basically it tells you squeeze 3 eighth notes into the space that would normally hold 2. So therefore, for each beat, which would normally be composed of 2 eighth notes, now we've suddenly transformed it to contain 3 eighth notes. And you can do the same thing with quarter notes. You can do it with any kinds of notes, but basically the idea is the same. In a bar of 2/4, we have 2 quarter notes. Now we're going to squeeze 3 quarter notes into the space where there would normally be 2. And that can be kind of hard to perform, because normally you'll be hearing the beats as 1, 2, 1, 2, right? So, but you have to be able to also count the 3 at the same time while that's also going on. It can be very distracting to hear 2s while you have to play 3s at the same time. So triple eighths or triplet quarter notes is what we're calling them here. Mathematically speaking, they're really not true eighths or true quarters, because if you look at it here, we took a third of a quarter, so a third of a quarter would be a 12th. But, this is what musicians call them. We're musicians, not mathematicians. Okay, now this is getting more exciting. We're talking about compound meters. So what the heck is a compound meter? Okay, 6/8, right? 6 eighth notes. So does that mean that there are 6 beats? It is 6 eighth notes, that's definitely correct, but there's actually 2 beats per bar, because we are organizing this into 2 groups of 3. That's how you could think of it. Each beat is going to last for 3 eighth notes, and we know that 3 eighth notes equals 1 dotted quarter note, so your beat is a single dotted quarter note, and there's 2 dotted quarter note beats in 6/8. 9/8 is basically the exact same thing, except we've added another dotted quarter note there, so 9 eighth notes, but 3 beats in a bar. We have beats naturally divided in thirds this time. Instead of having to do that weird triplet thing, the dotted quarter note is naturally divided into 3 parts. And so I like to call those small parts, those are small beats, and the big beats are on 1. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 3s and 2s happening at the same time, kind of in 6/8, but not necessarily a confusing way. We don't have 3 against 2 because we have, for every 1 beat, we have 3 eighth notes, and that's not too bad. Now we get to some really funky stuff down here. 7/8, 5/8. What the heck does this even mean? So 7/8 and 5/8 are weird because we can't divide 7 or 5 into groups of equal size. You can try it if you want. What if we wanted to make groups of 2? Well, then one of these eighth notes would be left over. There's no way to do it. So we could divide it up like this. The first beat is going to be a dotted quarter note. The second 2 is going to be regular quarter notes. And so then what that means is that your beats are not the same length. So it seems like, your big beats, as I like to call them, the ones that are made out of multiple eighth notes, some of them seem rushed and some of them seem to lag. And then with 5/8, it's the same idea. You could divide it into a beat of a dotted quarter note and then a quarter note. As I hope you're seeing, there's multiple ways to group the eighth notes together. So, you could put the dotted quarter note beat at the end instead in the 7/8 measure instead of at the beginning. The point is there's multiple possible ways to group these eighth notes, and you probably won't hear these meters very often if you ever do. But I still like to talk about it. So, hey, wait a minute. Isn't 6/8 the same as 2/4 with triplet eighth notes? Well, if you've been paying attention, your observation is particularly astute, right? Both will specify 2 beats, and each beat is going to be divided into 3 equal parts. So why do we bother with 2 different, forms of expressing the same idea? You're familiar with, in all languages, there's things called synonyms, right? Different words, but they have the same meaning. It depends how formal you want to be speaking to somebody, right? If you're just talking with your friends, you would probably say yes. If you were speaking more formally, you might say affirmative. It means the same thing, but the context is slightly different, and that's what we're dealing with right here. The question to ask is what are we hearing? Do we really hear the 3s, as in 6/8? You hear the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Or are these, division of 3s, are they really fast or are they implied? Right? And when I say implied, it means that you're not enunciating every of those 3 eighth notes. You might just enunciate 2 of them. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you could enunciate it as 1, 3, 4, 6. But really what I'm trying to say, that's a long way of saying, if your beats are going by really quickly and there's a division into 3, then it probably makes more sense to write it as 2/4 and just use the triplets when needed. Whereas 6/8, it implies those 3s are really there. They're not going so fast that you can't even observe them. Also, another thing to point out is that if the beats were divided into 3s for most of the song, why would you want to write triplets all the time? That would be very inconvenient for notation's sake. But again, the notation is just a way of talking about it. I don't really want you to internalize the notation as much as I want you to understand the concepts. So we've learned that we have these rhythm, there's different kinds of notes that last for different durations, and we group music into measures, and these measures last the same amount, and they will contain a certain amount of things in them. So I'd like to wrap this up with an example. Let's just bring it all together, right? This is a very familiar excerpt. Notice that the notes are moving around the staff, so the pitches are changing, but we don't care about that right now. Let's just focus on the rhythm, and let's ask ourselves, what does this sound like? Okay, so if you're paying attention, that probably sounds like Farajacas. When we come back next time and we talk about notes, I'll actually try to show you what that sounds like from the perspective of pitches and rhythms happening at the same time. But until then, that's been my sort of lecture for today. So I hope you enjoyed, and we will meet together sooner rather than later.